Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we welcome to our program Nancy Yanofsky, who is from back east and has a most impressive background, and we're so delighted that she can be with us to discuss a number of topics. I guess I would categorize this as futurism, particularly looking at issues such as curriculum internationally and how we might deal with that. As to her credentials, she is the co-director of WorldWise 2000, which is a national educational campaign for the last decade of this century. She is also the former director of college and community programs at the Foreign Policy Association. She served at one time as consultant to Vice President Walter Mondale's task force on youth employment. She is a 1962 graduate of Boston University with honors, and she did her graduate work at Georgetown University. We're so happy to have you on the program, and we look forward to the interview.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I'm very happy to have three panel members who are highly qualified today to question our distinguished guests. First to my left is Idaho State Senator Mary Lou Reed. Next to her is Dr. Dennis Connors, who is the Dean of Academic Affairs at North Idaho College. And next to him is Steve Schink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And I shall ask Senator Reed to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony, and may I add my welcome to Idaho, Nancy.
Thank you.
Are we adding another state to your collection?
You are.
And since we're talking about geography today, why it's nice to be able to add that to your collection. Would you tell us a bit about your quest for what you call international literacy?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I guess the best way that I can really describe that quest is by talking about the campaign that I am co-directing, which is called WorldWise 2000. It is very akin to a political campaign, except a major difference is that with a political campaign, you elect somebody to an office. With this campaign, as an educational campaign, what we are hoping is that all sectors of the American public, that means every individual in American society, will elect to enter the 21st century more knowledgeable, aware, informed, and involved in international issues, number one. Number two, given the fact that the world is changing rapidly, and more rapidly than most people ever imagined possible, and with it America's role in the world is changing, we're finding that our old assumptions won't work, and what we really need to do is develop a new way of thinking and a new way of doing. What we want is the American public, given that we live in a democratic society, to be able to help set a new agenda for America to follow. Clearly there are a variety of ways that that can happen, but the overall way that we want people to do that is by getting involved and working in their local levels.
Well, that's a wonderful campaign, but how are you going to go about achieving these very worldwide goals?
They're both worldwide and world-wise, I will say, because what we are hoping is that the American public will be on their road to becoming world-wise by the year 2000. It would really be very presumptuous of me to tell you that we had the entire campaign strategy all worked out. Because if in fact it is a campaign for the American people, then they have to really help us set what that agenda is. I can tell you how we're going to begin. I can tell you a few things that we're going to do. I can tell you where I hope that we get, but I can't fill in a whole lot of the missing pieces in between that. We want to formally announce the campaign on October 22nd, 1990. We've picked that day because there are a lot of international things that happen during the week of October. One of them, and during the month of October, one of them is National Food Day, another one is UN Day, and there are a number of other international things that happened at that time too. We want to have, at that point, 50 charter communities that will have said, yes, we want to sign on, and we want to help move this campaign forward. What will happen after these 50 communities announce and are announced is that the organizers will go back into their communities and will put together task forces that represent a variety of different sectors within the community. In spring of 1991, and we do not have the date then, we will have either that same 50 or by then maybe 100 charter communities that will be able to inaugurate the campaign by explicitly detailing and articulating what they will do and what will happen in their communities to make them world-wise. Consonant with that, or concomitant with that at the same time, we will hopefully have put together a national media program that will also inaugurate the campaign, that will talk about a number of issues, that will talk about a number of themes and messages that we will have developed in combination with our participating organizations. At this point, we have over 100 participating organizations from a variety of different sectors of the American public that have really said, we believe in the vision of WorldWise 2000. Sign us on. We will pay you $200 to join, and we will do that annually so that we can work with you to help set the campaign strategy and the campaign goals. By the year 2000, we hope to have 2,000 communities across the United States, and you can have a very liberal definition. I don't mean that in terms of politically liberal, but I mean in terms of linguistically liberal definition of what a community is, whether it's a neighborhood, whether it's a city, whether it's a municipality, whether it's a town, whether it's a school, whether it's a community center, but a group, a community that has really figured out some benchmarks for them to work towards to really become WorldWise.
I have to share.
Nancy, I'm fascinated by some of the background that you have in public interest in education, and looking at it from an educator standpoint, what could you say that education, be it basic schooling, the K-12, or higher education, what role do they play in this?
In the campaign?
Yes. How could you define it for them? What would you tell them?
I would tell them two things, a minimum of two things. The first thing that I would tell them is that we need their help, because in fact for K through 12 students and for college students, as trite as it may sound, they are the future. I look back to where I was when I graduated from college in 1962, and even younger than that in the 50s. There was a very different feeling about this country, and there was probably a very different feeling about the world. I'm not sure that people felt that they had as much say as I believe that they have now. They're going to inherit, in the year 2000, the people who are in college now, 10 years hence, are really going to be in their 30s and are really going to be groomed to be the next leaders of this generation. They are going to be responsible for carrying out an agenda. I want to know what they think about national security and what the national security policies of this country should be. I want to know what they think about the environment and what they think the environmental policies should be. I want to know what they think about education and what they think the educational policies should be. I want to know what they think about terrorism and how they think that as a country we can really combat that. I want them to know what their thinking is on drug and international drug trafficking. And from their perspective, which unfortunately is a lot closer to the issues than mine is, I want to know what they feel that they can do to help combat international drugs. I've heard people say that drug trafficking is the #1 international crisis facing this country and the world. So what I would be willing to do with them is to say that there are a number of issues that are out there. You pick and choose the issues that you feel most comfortable with, that you really want to see go forward. And together, let's help set a new agenda for the way this country is going to carry them out. You can do that by the people that you elect. If you have a particular agenda that you want to have forward, you can articulate that. You can work with the media. You can articulate that on national media, statewide media, on the local media. You can begin to get your views known. You can elect people who are then going to be able to push those views forward. As Harlan Cleveland, who's the former dean of the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, has said, the people determine what the issues are, the legislators legislate what the people tell them to do, and the president announces what those legislative policies are. It's a pretty radical view of the role of people in this country, but it is certainly one that I subscribe to.
Steve Sheen.
Nancy, I have to believe that you would not embark on such an ambitious campaign if you did not believe strongly that there's a real need in this country to make Americans more aware of international issues. How do we rank? Are we desperately unaware of what goes on outside our own borders?
No. In fact, people probably know more than you might think that they do. As I said this afternoon at the luncheon when I spoke, I feel that the American people are on the horns of a dilemma. The American people in general, and I think that the young people in our country are also on the horns of a dilemma. In terms of the American people in general, I think that they know that interdependence and internationalism is here, that it affects them, and that cooperation is better than destructive competition. I think that I think we cannot do away with competition. I think in many ways competition is not bad. Again, as a linguist I say, we need to define it in a new way. That's one side of the dilemma. On the other side of the dilemma is the fact that given that the American people know that, they're rather uncertain as to what to do. They don't know how to change their lives in order to integrate this internationalism and this interdependent phenomenon into their lives. And what's happened is that across this country it has really engendered a wave of nationalism rather than internationalism. In many ways what this campaign is about is really forging a wedge in that dilemma and really exposing that dilemma and saying to the people, okay, here's the dilemma, how do we solve it? In terms of the young people in this country, they are faced with another dilemma. In order for them to work, they need to be a lot more knowledgeable and aware of international issues because, in fact, we are facing a new world. In many ways, what we're talking about is the survival of a nation in a new world order. I don't really want to be extreme, but I think that the nuts and bolts of it, that's what it is. Their jobs are going to be dependent on a real nuts and bolts knowledge of international issues, of higher technology. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about blue-collar worker or white-collar workers. At the same time that is so, we find more young people who are uninformed, disinterested, or misinformed about international issues. I think that the campaign, the message is there. I mean, we know where we're going. We're dealing with the American public, with the adult American public on the one hand, and with the youth on the other. And there has to be an intersection. Talking about internationalism and going across our borders, we have to go intergenerational in this country right now, too. It's the same phenomenon.
Nancy, it's very important for me to indicate to our audience that we must thank Lewis-Clark State College in Lewiston, Idaho, for your appearance. We've been working the past couple of weeks with that institution in a symposium they're doing, and we're grateful to them for you being here as a guest. If you don't mind, I'd like to play the devil's advocate. I think sometimes that is very important as we try to question a proposal, and your proposal is an exciting one. But as I look at your energy and excitement and the participatory democracy idea and how beneficial that can be, but I look at it from a perspective of sometimes being overwhelmed by the amount of apathy that one may find. But I'm really thinking of something else, and that is that as we're going into a new era, what is happening in the Soviet Union, in Poland, and Hungary is really politically a revolution.
Absolutely.
What is going on in Europe with the parliament that's coming into being in 1992 is going to change this world. What's happening in Japan. So my question, I guess, is one, do you feel somewhat overwhelmed that as the American people start to deal with not only domestic issues, but how this relates to international issues, how much expertise are we going to need before we can make those decisions of where we want to go? And can people meet in town meetings and so forth and do this, or must they really prepare themselves? One final point for you to respond.
So far, I'll just say all of the above.
Yes, okay. But geography, for example, is something that's really, really poor in this country, in the school systems, not even knowing about countries and where they are. That's a pessimistic statement, but how are you going to cope with that overwhelming problem?
All right, let me start with your last question first and then
Yes.
go to the others. And if I forget them, you can remind me. We are, I think, geographically illiterate. However, if people take that statement and then say, what I'm going to do is now have every student in my class memorize a world map, and feel that if the students can regurgitate back to them where cities and towns and countries and nations are, and feel that they have succeeded, I will say that they have not. Therefore, what I'm really saying is you have to put geography and geographic awareness into a context. So to know where the Soviet Union is without knowing anything about the people, without knowing anything about its linguistic diversity, without knowing anything about its political stance and the history of its politics, without knowing anything about the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, or between the Soviet Union and the United States. And I change those words on purpose because I think it makes a difference what comes first, the way you then interpret what I'm going to say. If we can't do all of that, if we can't then also deal with the literature of the Soviet Union, that's what I think we mean by creating a geographically literate society. It's much more than figuring out a place on the map. One of the ways that I think that you can deal with that is by bringing it home to you. I find it very interesting and very exciting to look at this nation. This is a pluralistic nation. I wish I had some wonderful statistics. I think that in Miami there are 84 languages that are spoken, and on the streets of Los Angeles the population represents 100 different countries around the world. If we just started there, if in every elementary school classroom around the country we asked people to delineate their ancestry and then took one by one and looked at it and looked at where it was and began to read some of the literature and began to understand some of the thinking, began to eat the food from that region, we would be increasing geographic literacy 100-fold in this country. That would also then, to your second question, really be promoting internationalism and international understanding. It's not only figuring out what's happening over there, it's figuring out what's happening over there that affects us in our personal lives, that affects us as a member of a community, that affects us as a member of a state, that affects us as a member of a nation. We can't compartmentalize anymore.
I want to get back to the panel, but one more thing. I hear you saying loud and clearly that it's going to require a different curriculum if we're going to cope with the new world. Do I not hear you say that students need to understand the politics, the economics, the social, the language, etc.?
Yes, I do. That's exactly what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. I find it very interesting, too, actually, that we're talking about internationalizing the curriculum. To my knowledge, there's never been a move afoot to nationalize the curriculum. So we've taken a compound word, which is international, without really dealing with one side of it. I'm not advocating nationalizing the curriculum for anybody that is listening outside. I am not advocating that at all.
Well, Nancy, you're talking about really radically changing the curriculum, or at least comprehensively changing it. Are you not also, though, talking about a different style of teaching and different style of learning? Does that go hand in hand? And would you kind of expand upon that? Because is there an extension of your ideas of participatory government that are also involved with participatory learning in the schools?
Absolutely. And if you go back to the idea that I suggested of really just sort of polling the students in a classroom about what their ancestry is, and then really allowing them to talk about it, to bring in some artifacts, to bring in some of their relatives who can then talk, and really sort of I'm not minimizing the role of the teacher. And a teacher, as far as I'm concerned, is a wonderful facilitator and a wonderful coordinator. But whether or not that teacher is the only or even the best sort of I don't know if this is grammatical, imparter of knowledge, I'm not sure. And I think that really what I'm talking about is really going hand in hand with school reform that's taking place all across this country right now. My husband would be very happy if I talked about what he was doing in White Plains, which is really total school reform in the school district there. But there's one part of what he's doing that I think is very relevant to what we're talking about. He's really helping to bring about the change in the way decisions are made in the elementary schools in White Plains, New York, by having instituted leadership councils made up of administrators, teachers, and parents. What I've said to him is, where are the kids? Because I think that even 6-year-olds have a role to play in what happens in their lives. I believe in participatory democracy. I mean, in 2-year-olds, really.
Well, now you're looking for these 50 communities. Are you also looking for a certain number of school districts? Are you going directly to the schools, or are you going to do that completely through the communities in your strategy?
If I can read between the lines to what you're saying, no, we're going to do the schools different from the communities, because I think if we pick a community and a school wants to join, that's fine. We might want to find some schools and then have the community join. I think we need to be able to develop a number of different ways. I also think that in selecting the communities, that we want to work with some communities who are already geared towards international issues, whether or not they have an international visitors program, whether they have a Sister Cities program, whether their mayor has already established an international office or something of that ilk. That would be one kind. But to then turn to the rest of the communities in the United States and say, you have to already be predisposed towards internationalism knowingly, and want the rest of you join on, is really not realistic. So we want to work with some that are, and we also want to work with some that really don't know that they are, and help them discover that they are, so that at the end we can really have an incredible panoply of communities around this country.
Dr. Connors.
Nancy, even though you say you're not advocating national curriculum, less than, 2-3 weeks ago, the president had a summit on education at the University of Virginia.
In quotes.
Okay. Even though Bill Bennett said it was PAP, still in all they had one.
They did.
It was only the third time a president ever called all the governors together to talk about anything, one specific topic.
And and governors are really taking the lead in international education.
Indeed. They're talking about a restructuring of the whole educational system. and school-based management is one of the ways that you're doing it. But if you're really going to take what Harlan Cleveland said to heart, and it begins at the grassroots level, how do you teach people, parents, if we're talking, let's talk about schools for a second, how do you teach parents to be advocates for what their children may learn or may not learn? How do you get them involved in dealing with the bureaucracy of a school? And if we're talking about a restructuring of the educational system, how do they do that? If it really starts there, how do you teach them to do that?
I don't know whether or not it's something that you teach them or whether or not it's something that they learn. And that's really not a semantic game. I think it really depends on a particular orientation that you might have. It's hard for me to imagine a parent who really doesn't care about the kind of education that his or her child receives. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is to validate with and for parents that those concerns are legitimate. One of the ways that I think that you do that, and it's actually a program that I'm involved in with another group that I probably shouldn't mention, but one of the things that I've been doing is writing a booklet on education in the community. And the purpose of this booklet would be to bring a community together. People who don't necessarily think alike, A or B, think that they have the right to articulate what they want the education life of their children to be like. And it's really giving them a forum with a little bit of leadership and with a little bit of facilitation to be able to work through some very hard, difficult issues and to be able to listen to what other people are saying and to then take sort of the commonalities between what people are among what people are saying and then move them to the next step. You have to have those discussions without administrators present, and then you have to also have those discussions with administrators present. You have to figure out some way, and I think that forums, small forums, are a perfect way to do that, where you really bring people who are not necessarily used to talking to one another together, or who don't think that they have any role to play to see that they do. And I think that I might have contradicted myself in the end, but I didn't mean to do that.
Steve Sheen.
Nancy, one of the goals of your campaign was involvement across the country in international affairs. If I'm living in Junction City, Kansas, which is not the geographic heart of the country, I've forgotten exactly where that is, but it's close, thousands of miles from any border with another country, how do I get involved in international affairs meaningfully?
Oh, I think that there are lots of ways. I think that one of the ways is by belonging to a study and discussion group. That's a very easy way, and there are lots of organizations that really have materials out there that people can read and talk about. And then I think that what has to happen is that people have to really come to understand and to see that internationalism is right there in their own community. And whether or not it's walking through your supermarket and making a list of the foods in your communities that are not grown on American soil, and figuring out something about those foods, which then leads you to figuring out something about those countries, which then leads you to figuring out something that your community can do with a community where that food is grown, and working through the United States Department of Agriculture Extension Service, Cooperative Extension Service, is one way that comes to mind. I think we have to dispel the myth that you have to leave these shores and experience another culture and another country in order to be international. And the flip side of that is when there are people in your communities who have traveled abroad, whether they be study on a study exchange program or just through individual travel, we have to figure out a way in communities to then use those people, to have them go out, to have them talk about their experience, to talk about the similarities between people, to talk about projects that can occur between one community overseas and another community. Whether you do that through Sister Cities, whether you do it through Partners of the Americas, whether you do it through People to People, whether you do it through the host of international exchange organizations that are out there, I don't know.
Nancy, I have to deal with another difficult question. I think the meeting that we're using here today is a very expensive one for candidates, and you don't get elected to major offices such as a senator from California or the President of the United States without a tremendous amount of money. And certainly when that happens, there's some strings attached to that process and decision making. How are you going to encourage the American people as they set an agenda that you're indicating that they're going to cope with the power of money and power as it does affect decision making of public policy?
It's a great question. It's clearly one that's very dear to my heart, since I just worked for a candidate that lost because his opponent outspent him. And I think that the message we have to be able to devise, we have to be able to figure out a way as a society to not let money talk that way. And give the message to the American public that anybody can buy their candidacy. I think, and that has nothing to do with you, so I don't want you to think that I'm attacking you, because I'm not. I'm not. And tell me, I think that you really should be addressing the question to her, not to me, but I will take a stab at it and tell me if I'm on the right track. It seems to me that there's no political candidate that doesn't care about the pulse of their constituency.
That's very correct.
And given that that is so, the American public needs to be able to be mobilized, to write letters, to call, to lobby their elected officials, and to really make their opinions known, backed up with facts. I mean, I know that sounds a little hokey, and I don't mean it to sound that way, but I think that there's a trade-off between numbers and money. And given that most of the candidates and most of the people who are in office want to get reelected, it's very important for them to know what their constituency is thinking and feeling. And if in fact they're going off in a direction that is against what their constituency wants to know, then we have to be able to sort of help bring them back. And I think through massive letter writing and talking to them and really working with them, we can do that. I also think, since I have the floor, can I just say one other thing about elected officials? And I think that you have a wonderful state legislator here, and I'm not sure whether or not she's the norm or whether she's atypical. My sense is that she's atypical. I think that we have to dispel the myth that international issues are only the province of national elected candidates and legislators, and we have to really begin to get state legislators to really bring international issues to their constituencies, and their constituencies to bring those issues to them as well.
On that note, we have to end the program. I wish we had more time. It's been most stimulating. I thank the panel for excellent questions, and you have been most informative, and come back to see us again at the future.
Thank you. Anytime you invite me, I will come.
Thank you. I want to also again thank Lewis Clark State College for making this program possible and providing the guests that they have over the past 2 weeks. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, when we will discuss what we believe to be an important subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.